Do you believe trauma runs in families like a pattern, or breaks with you?
The fluorescent lights of that bustling Italian restaurant in the heart of downtown Chicago hummed overhead like a persistent swarm of summer cicadas that refused to quiet down even as the evening crowd thinned out, casting a warm yet unforgiving glow over our oversized corner booth where artificial vines dangled from the walls in a vain attempt to soften the edges of family tensions that had been simmering for years beneath the surface of forced smiles and obligatory small talk. And there I was, Rachel Harlan, a 42-year-old graphic designer scraping by in a modest apartment in Milwaukee, feeling every bit the interloper as I adjusted the collar of my navy blue dress that I'd chosen specifically because Mom had always insisted that dressing up showed respect, even though deep down I knew that no amount of fabric or makeup could bridge the invisible divide that had marked my place in this adoptive family since the day they brought me home from that agency in Ohio when I was just 6 months old, a wide-eyed infant with no clue about the lifelong audition I'd been cast in without my consent. The occasion was Linda's 45th birthday celebration, my older sister by 3 years who had always worn her status as the biological child like a crown of entitlement, her perfectly highlighted bob haircut swaying as she laughed too loudly at her own jokes, while surrounded by the full Harlan clan including our parents, Aunt Clara with her booming voice and endless anecdotes about church bake sales, and a smattering of cousins who only showed up for the promise of free desserts and the chance to catch up on the latest neighborhood gossip that inevitably circled back to someone else's misfortune. What began as a seemingly harmless family dinner, complete with baskets of garlic bread that filled the air with an aroma so comforting it almost tricked me into believing we were just like any other Midwestern clan gathering for a milestone, quickly unraveled into the kind of public humiliation that sticks to your ribs worse than the heavy fettuccine alfredo we'd all ordered from the specials menu, because as the waiter made his rounds refilling water glasses and wine stems with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen 1,000 dysfunctional meals unfold on these very checkered tablecloths, Linda leaned forward with that signature gleam in her eye, the one that always preceded one of her cutting remarks disguised as humor, and declared in a voice that carried across the entire dining room like an announcement over the restaurant speakers, "Rachel, why don't you scoot on over to another table? This one's reserved for real family, not adopted girls trying to play pretend." Her words landing with the precision of a thrown dart that hit its mark right in the center of my chest, drawing an eruption of awkward laughter from the group that wasn't so much about the joke itself, but more about the collective relief of having the uncomfortable truth voiced aloud for once, allowing everyone to join in without having to own their own complicity in the years of subtle exclusions that had chipped away at my sense of belonging from the time I was a teenager navigating high school hallways alone while they bonded over shared bloodlines and inside stories I could never fully grasp. Mom let out a nervous chuckle into the folds of her napkin, her eyes darting away as if the patterned fabric held some escape from the discomfort radiating from my direction, while Dad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pretending to fiddle with the settings on his phone to avoid meeting my gaze that must have been pleading for some kind of intervention, and Aunt Clara's guffaw shook her ample frame so violently that it sent ripples through her glass of iced tea, spilling a few drops onto the tablecloth that no one bothered to wipe up, leaving dark stains as metaphors for the unresolved messes we all carried into these gatherings. But I refused to let the heat rising in my cheeks betray the storm brewing inside me. The kind of quiet fury that had built up over decades of birthday cards signed with love from the Harlans that always felt a shade less genuine for me. So instead, I plastered on a smile that probably came across more as a strained grimace and lifted my water glass in a mock toast, quipping something about how the family that slays together stays together, or at least that's what they say in those old mob movies Dad loves, which elicited a few polite nods and sips, but no real engagement. Just the continuation of the conversation shifting seamlessly to Linda's recent promotion at the bank where she managed loans for people who actually had collateral, unlike the rest of us scraping by on freelance gigs and modest salaries. And as the desserts made their grand entrance with Linda's cannoli piled high with powdered sugar like a crown for the queen of the evening, I excused myself to the restroom under the pretense of freshening up, where the cold water from the faucet did little to cool the burn of embarrassment as I stared at my reflection in the smudged mirror, noting how my green eyes, so unlike the brown ones shared by the rest of the table, seemed to hold a lifetime of questions about origins and acceptance that no amount of therapy sessions back home could fully unpack. Returning to the booth, I found the chatter had moved on without missing a beat, everyone oohing and awing over Linda's tales of corporate conquests as if my brief absence had erased the sting of her earlier comment. So I settled back into my seat and poked at the Spumoni ice cream that had arrived in my absence, its cherry topping tasting oddly bitter against the backdrop of their easy camaraderie. The kind that came from growing up under the same roof with the same bedtime stories and holiday traditions that I'd only ever observed from the edges, like a guest at my own life. And just when I thought the evening couldn't drag on much longer in this veil of pretense, the waiter approached once more, this time bearing the leather-bound bill folder that typically got passed around for Dad to handle with his usual gruff efficiency. But on this night, with a subtle flick of his wrist and an expression that betrayed nothing of the drama he'd likely overheard from the kitchen pass-through, he placed it squarely in front of Linda, announcing the total as $320.18 in a tone as neutral as the restaurant's endless breadsticks, causing the table to fall into a stunned hush with forks suspended midair and eyes widening in collective surprise. Linda's saucer-like stare fixed on the folder as if it were a venomous snake before she thrust it toward Dad with a sputter about how the math couldn't possibly add up since everyone had stuck to the affordable pasta specials and shared appetizers. But in that suspended moment of chaos, I reached calmly into my purse, extracted my credit card with a steadiness that surprised even myself amid the internal whirlwind, and slid it across the table to the waiter without uttering a single word, my lips curving into a genuine smile for the first time that night because covering the entire tab felt like the most elegant form of retaliation I could muster. A silent declaration that while they might question my place at the table, my ability to hold it together, and even foot the bill proved I was more than capable of standing on my own, and as the transaction processed with a quiet beep from the handheld device, Linda's complexion flushed a shade deeper than the candy staining her lips, the earlier laughter evaporating into uncomfortable silence that hung heavy in the air like the remnants of a poorly timed joke. Gathering my coat and scarf with deliberate slowness, I prepared to slip out into the drizzly Chicago night that promised a solitary walk back to my car parked a few blocks away. The cool mist already beating on the windows of the restaurant as if washing away the residue of the evening's awkwardness. But just as I turned toward the exit, a calm voice addressed me from behind, soft yet insistent enough to halt my steps in their tracks, saying, "Excuse me, miss. Could you stay just a moment longer, please?" And when I pivoted to face the speaker, it was the waiter holding a small, nondescript envelope in his outstretched hand, his expression a careful mask of professionalism tinged with something deeper, an unreadable flicker in his eyes that hinted this interlude had little to do with gratuities or forgotten items, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the autumn chill seeping through the door. That small envelope clutched in my hand felt disproportionately heavy as I finally stepped out of the restaurant into the steady drizzle that transformed the bustling Chicago sidewalk into a glistening mirror, reflecting the blurred neon glow from the nearby bars and late-night delis, prompting me to duck quickly under the protective awning of a corner coffee shop where the aroma of freshly brewed beans mingled with the damp night air to offer a fleeting sense of normalcy amid the whirlwind of emotions still churning from the evening's humiliating centerpiece, and with my fingers still tingling from the chill and the adrenaline, I tore open the plain paper seal under the faint shelter light, revealing a single note scrawled in what appeared to be faded blue ink on ordinary stationery that read simply, "Rachel Harlan, the story they've told you about your beginnings doesn't hold all the pieces. Meet me at the Clark and Division Diner tomorrow noon if you're ready to learn about the locket's true origin," followed by initials EM that stirred only a vague flicker of recognition in the back of my mind. perhaps tied to one of those dusty photo albums Mom kept stashed away in the attic like relics from a life she preferred to gloss over with her standard tales of uncomplicated family bliss. Glancing back through the rain-streaked restaurant window, I caught a glimpse of the family still clustered around the table nursing their after-dinner coffees. Linda gesturing animatedly with her hands as if recounting my unexpected bill-paying escapade to the rapt audience of cousins and Aunt Clara, who nodded along with exaggerated expressions of shock. And despite the sting of her earlier barb, still fresh like a paper cut that wouldn't stop bleeding, I couldn't suppress a low chuckle, bubbling up from my chest at the thought of how her grand birthday celebration had ended with her ego taking a bigger hit than her wallet ever could, a petty satisfaction that warmed me more effectively than the steam wafting from the coffee shop door as harried patrons brushed past on their way to warmer havens. The drive back to my modest hotel room on the outskirts of the Loop unfolded in a hazy rhythm of windshield wipers swishing back and forth against the persistent rain that seemed to mirror the unresolved storm inside my head, replaying every excruciating moment from Linda's loud proclamation that had turned the booth into a stage for my exclusion to the way Dad had averted his eyes during my silent payment, as though acknowledging my gesture would force him to confront the cracks in the family facade he'd spent decades patching with work stories and weekend barbecues, and by the time I collapsed onto the stiff queen-sized bed with its threadbare comforter that smelled faintly of previous occupants' regrets, I'd already decided to keep the noon appointment because in the grand scheme of my solitary life back in Milwaukee, filled with freelance design gigs for local businesses and evenings spent scrolling through adoption forums late into the night, the allure of even a sliver of truth about my roots outweighed the rational warnings whispering that chasing shadows from a waiter's note might lead to more disappointment than discovery. Morning arrived with the insistent blare of my phone alarm set deliberately early to account for the notorious Chicago traffic that could turn a 10-minute drive into a half-hour crawl, allowing me just enough time to shower off the night's residue and throw on a pair of comfortable jeans paired with a simple sweater that felt more like armor than attire for whatever revelations awaited. And I arrived at the diner a full 5 minutes ahead of schedule, claiming a worn vinyl booth in the back corner where the scent of sizzling bacon and bottomless coffee pots evoked memories of simpler diners from my childhood road trips with the family, though those outings always carried an undercurrent of me tagging along rather than fully belonging. The bell above the door jingled sharply just as I glanced at my watch, announcing the arrival of a woman who appeared to be in her late 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun and a cardigan sweater that gave her the air of a retired schoolteacher harboring secrets sharper than any lesson plan. And she made a beeline for my booth without hesitation, sliding into the seat opposite me while pretending to peruse the laminated menu as a shield against any eavesdroppers in the sparsely populated lunchtime crowd of construction workers and office escapees. Introducing herself as Evelyn Matthews, the EM from the note, she explained in a voice lowered to a conspiratorial murmur that she'd waitressed at the Italian place for over 30 years, long enough to recognize faces from the neighborhood and overhear fragments of conversations that painted vivid pictures of private lives, including a tipsy rant from Linda years earlier about the adopted sister who always gets a pass, which had jogged Evelyn's memory of a faded photograph tucked into an old wallet she'd found once during a lost-and-found shift. A snapshot showing a young couple with a baby that bore an uncanny resemblance to the Harlan family portraits circulating at community events. As she unfolded the tale with the caution of someone who'd witnessed too many family implosions over greasy hash browns, Evelyn revealed that she'd been a casual acquaintance of my adoptive parents from their university days in Champaign, close enough to attend a few barbecues where she'd glimpsed adoption documents tucked away in a drawer, papers that suggested my origins involved more complexity than the clean, closed adoption narrative Mom and Dad had always recited like a well-rehearsed script at holiday gatherings, hinting instead at a birth mother from a rural Indiana town whose circumstances involved financial desperation and whispered scandals that the agency had buried deep to facilitate the match. Pressing her gently for more specifics while the waitress refilled our mugs with coffee strong enough to wake the dead, I learned that the locket I wore, a simple silver heart on a delicate chain, presented to me by Mom on my 16th birthday with vague assurances of its sentimental value, might actually be an heirloom passed down through bloodlines rather than a generic trinket. Its inner compartment once holding a tiny photograph that Evelyn believed connected to a Harlan ancestor on Dad's side, implying that my adoption could carry threads of biological entanglement the family had deliberately severed to maintain their picture-perfect suburban image in Naperville. My pulse quickened with a cocktail of exhilaration and apprehension as these fragments assembled into a narrative that challenged the very foundation of my identity, the one I'd pieced together from school records listing adopted in fine print and family albums where I appeared suddenly at age 1 without prelude yet. Evelyn grew evasive when I probed deeper, cautioning that Linda harbored her own resentments fueled by a recent glimpse into Dad's will that divided assets evenly among all children regardless of biology. Viewing my inclusion as an unfair dilution of her entitled share, especially now that her marriage had crumbled under the weight of her husband's gambling debts. Departing the diner with my head swirling like the steam rising from my untouched Danish, I felt the weight of this partial truth settle over me like an ill-fitting coat, compelling me to fire off a quick text to my closest friend back home, a fellow designer who'd endured her own family dramas, detailing the bizarre turn without naming names, her reply of supportive emojis doing little to quell the questions multiplying faster than the raindrops pattering against my car windows. That same evening, safely ensconced in the familiar clutter of my Milwaukee apartment with its walls adorned in my own abstract prints that served as distractions from the voids in my personal history, I yielded to the impulse for a dash of digital retribution by posting a subtle Instagram story featuring a blurred photo of the restaurant bill folder alongside a caption musing about treating the fam to a lesson in unexpected dividends. Turns out some family ties come with interest, which garnered a flurry of likes from distant acquaintances and even a thumbs up from an old college roommate, but within the hour my phone erupted with an incoming call from Linda, her voice crackling over the line with the shrill urgency of someone whose spotlight had been stolen mid-performance, accusing me of deliberately shaming her on social media in front of their shared network of bank colleagues and church friends, demanding that I delete the post immediately or face the consequences of further estrangement from the family fold. Laughing softly to myself at the irony of her outrage over a harmless jab that paled in comparison to her public slight, I responded with measured calm that if she craved the privileges of true sisterhood, perhaps she should start by extending a modicum of it my way instead of wielding exclusion like a weapon at every opportunity. And as we disconnected with her hurling vague threats into the ether, my device buzzed once more with an unidentified number displaying an area code from the Indiana border, the voice on the other end emerging calm and measured yet laced with an undercurrent of familiarity that sent chills racing along my arms, stating plainly, "Rachel, it's crucial we discuss what Evelyn shared with you today. Pursuing this path alone could uncover dangers you haven't anticipated." The unidentified voice on that call, gravelly and edged with the weariness of someone who'd navigated more family minefields than any one person should have to endure, belonged to a man named Tom who introduced himself as a distant cousin on the Harlan side through Dad's brother who'd passed away young from a factory accident back in the 80s. And he proposed we meet the following afternoon in a quiet park along the Evanston Lakeshore, where the crash of Lake Michigan waves could drown out any accidental overhearers while providing a neutral ground far removed from the prying eyes of Linda and her network of nosy acquaintances who seemed to thrive on dissecting every Harlan hiccup over coffee klatches and neighborhood block parties. Agreeing without much hesitation despite the sensible part of my brain flashing warnings about trusting strangers who materialized from cryptic notes and diner confessions, I spent the rest of that restless night in my Milwaukee apartment sifting through the cluttered shelves of my home office where boxes of inherited mementos gathered dust like forgotten promises, eventually hauling down the heavy leather-bound family album that Mom had gifted me years ago during one of her guilt-fueled cleaning sprees, its pages filled with yellowed photographs capturing staged moments of joy from Christmases and graduations that always positioned me slightly off-center as if even the camera lens knew I didn't quite align with the core group. Flipping through those glossy images under the harsh glow of my desk lamp, I spotted subtle clues that Evelyn's words had primed me to notice. Like a snapshot from my early childhood showing Dad holding me with an expression of fierce protectiveness that bordered on secrecy, and another of Linda as a toddler glaring at a bassinet where I presumably lay. Her tiny fists clenched in what could only be interpreted as precocious jealousy over the attention suddenly diverted from her throne as the only child. The park in Evanston welcomed me the next day with a brisk autumn breeze rustling the turning leaves into a colorful carpet that crunched underfoot like brittle memories giving way. And I claimed a weathered wooden bench overlooking the vast expanse of the lake where sailboats dotted the horizon like distant escape vessels from the entanglements I was wading deeper into. My thermos of herbal tea doing little to steady the nerves jangling from the previous day's revelations that already threatened to upend the fragile equilibrium I'd maintained with the family by showing up to gatherings without demanding more than surface-level affection. Tom arrived punctually, a sturdy man in his mid-50s with a faded Chicago Bears cap shadowing his weathered face and a build that spoke of years spent laboring at the auto plant alongside Dad before a slipped disc forced his early retirement. Carrying his own battered thermos that he offered up as honest coffee without the hard stuff to grease the wheels of conversation amid the sporadic joggers and dog walkers who paid us no mind in the open space. Settling beside me with the caution of a man who'd learned the hard way that family secrets could explode like faulty airbags, he corroborated Evelyn's account in greater detail, recounting how he'd assisted Dad with sorting through desk drawers at the old house in Naperville a few years back after Mom's minor health scare prompted a will review. Stumbling upon adoption papers yellowed with age that listed a birth mother named Elise from a struggling mill town in southern Indiana whose relinquishment stemmed not from mere hardship but from a tangled web of scandal involving unpaid debts and rumors of coercion by the very agency that facilitated my placement with the Harlans. As the wind picked up and whipped tiny whitecaps across the lake surface, Tom's narrative delved into the locket's significance, describing how he'd overheard Dad muttering once about its origins during a late-night poker game among plant buddies, claiming it as a Harlan heirloom engraved on the inside with initials that matched a great-aunt on his mother's line, suggesting the possibility that my adoption intertwined with actual blood relations through some overlooked paternal connection that the family had chosen to ignore in favor of a clean slate, a revelation that sent my mind reeling with implications about identity and inheritance that could rewrite not just my story, but the dynamics at every Thanksgiving table where Linda lorded her biological status like a badge of superiority. He painted a vivid picture of Linda's growing resentment, fueled by a recent consultation with the family attorney where she'd learned Dad's updated will divided the estate equally among his daughters, regardless of adoption status, viewing my share as an unjust encroachment on what she considered her rightful legacy, especially after her messy divorce left her scrambling to maintain the upscale lifestyle she'd built on shared assets and her banking salary that barely covered the alimony payments, warning me that probing further risked unearthing painful truths like the whispers of Dad's brief extramarital involvement during a rough patch in his marriage that might link back to Elise. Tom urged caution while slipping me a photocopy of a faded letter from the adoption file mentioning biological claims pending, a document that felt like a live wire in my pocket as we parted with promises to stay in touch, leaving me to drive homeward with the album riding shotgun like a co-conspirator in my quest for clarity. That evening, during a routine video call with Mom where she appeared in her cozy kitchen, dusted with flour from experimenting with a new recipe for apple crisp that she swore would be the hit of the next family potluck, I danced around the edges of the discoveries without diving into the depths, inquiring innocently about the locket's history while watching her features tighten into that familiar mask of deflection she deployed whenever conversations veered toward my origins, responding with lighthearted anecdotes about my childhood antics like the time I finger-painted the garage wall instead of embracing the family scrapbooking tradition. And in choosing to withhold Tom's explosive insights, I recognized the manipulative undercurrent of my secrecy, A decision that might protect her fragile heart, but also eroded the trust we'd painstakingly rebuilt after my 20s spent drifting through relationships that echoed my sense of displacement, prompting a twinge of self-doubt about whether I was seeking truth or simply arming myself for a confrontation that could fracture the only home I'd ever known. The following morning brought an unexpected opportunity for revenge when Aunt Clara forwarded details about a family online auction for assorted heirlooms intended to bankroll Linda's long-dreamed-of kitchen renovation that would transform their Naperville colonial into a Pinterest showcase, and spotting a listing for what purported to be a vintage pearl necklace from Grandma Harlan's collection. I placed an anonymous bid through a secondary account only to redirect the winning item, a cheap imitation I'd suspected from the blurry photos, to a charity auction for adoption support services, ensuring the proceeds benefited kids in situations like my own, while Aunt Clara vented frustrations in the family group chat about shady interlopers ruining the fun, a clever redirection that filled me with a guilty thrill at watching Linda's plan snag without her ever tracing it back to me directly. Yet the true escalation arrived later that afternoon as I lingered in my apartment sorting through Dad's old email archives that I'd accessed years prior under the guise of helping with tech support, unearthing a chain of correspondence with an estate lawyer dated around my high school graduation discussing contested adoption elements and potential challenges from biological kin that hinted at stakes far higher than sentimental trinkets. My concentration broken by the sudden trill of my doorbell that revealed Linda on my doorstep uninvited and fuming, her posture rigid as she accused me of conspiring with shady contacts to undermine the family equilibrium. But before I could formulate a response, she leaned in close enough for me to overhear her muttering into her phone about escalating things to protect what's mine in a tone that chilled me more than the draft from the hallway. Linda's unannounced appearance on my doorstep that afternoon transformed the quiet sanctuary of my Milwaukee apartment into an impromptu arena for confrontation, her designer heels echoing sharply against the hardwood floor as she pushed past me without invitation and launched into a tirade that blended accusations of betrayal with demands for details on my recent meetings, her eyes narrowing with the predatory focus of someone convinced that every family secret held the key to preserving her precarious perch at the top of the Harlan hierarchy. And while she paced the length of my living room gesturing wildly about how my meddling with outsiders threatened to drag the entire clan into unnecessary drama, especially with Dad's health checks looming and the wills divisions already sowing discord among the aunts and uncles who whispered about fairness in private texts, I stood there in the doorway for a moment, arms crossed over my sweater as if to shield myself from the verbal onslaught, choosing to respond with measured deflections that revealed nothing substantial about Tom or the adoption papers while subtly probing her knowledge of the locket. And in her heated response, she let slip an inadvertent clue that sent my mind racing ahead to uncharted territories, mentioning offhand how Mom had once hired a private investigator during my college years to trace any loose ends from the adoption process. An investigator whose reports had pointed toward a woman named Elise in Gary, Indiana, who might represent more than just a footnote in my origin story, but potentially a thread connecting back to Dad in ways that could unravel the neat narrative of unwavering marital fidelity Mom had always projected during those tense family counseling sessions after Linda's teenage rebellions. As she finally stormed out with a parting shot about watching my step because blood will always tell in the end, leaving the door ajar and a chill draft in her wake, I felt the familiar cocktail of vindication and isolation settle over me, pondering the dilemma of whether to chase this lead solo to avoid burdening Mom with implications that might implicate Dad's past indiscretions or to loop her in for the sake of transparency. A choice that viewers of this unfolding saga might view as overly vengeful when healing through open dialogue could mend more than any solitary quest ever would. The following morning, fueled by a restless night of dreams where lockets opened to reveal faces both familiar and foreign, I set out on the Tower Drive to Gary under a sky heavy with overcast clouds that mirrored the uncertainty swirling in my gut. The industrial landscape of rusting steel mills and faded billboards for long-defunct factories unfolding along the highway like chapters from a forgotten Rust Belt memoir that evoked the very hardships Evelyn had alluded to in Elise's background. And arriving at the nondescript boarding house address Tom had texted as a potential starting point, now repurposed into modest apartments for seasonal workers. I knocked on the manager's door with a rehearsed story about researching family history for a genealogy project that wouldn't raise immediate suspicions. The manager, a wiry woman in her 70s named Dolores with laugh lines etched deep from years of managing transient lives and their accompanying dramas, invited me into her cluttered office where stacks of ledgers chronicled decades of tenants, and after a few minutes of polite conversation over lukewarm tea from a chipped mug, she recalled Elise vaguely as a quiet seamstress who'd rented a room in the late 70s before vanishing abruptly around the time of my birth, her departure coinciding with rumors of a lost child and financial pressures from a family business gone under. But the real jolt came when Dolores pulled a dog-eared rental agreement from the archives showing endorsements tied to adoption facilitation fees paid through a Chicago agency, hinting at coerced arrangements that the state had overlooked in the rush to place infants with stable homes like the Harlans. Pressing further while the scent of mothballs from the old files clung to my clothes, I learned that Elise had a younger brother who'd inquired about her effects just months ago, describing a search for a daughter or sister named Rachel with distinctive green eyes that matched my own. And before I left, Dolores handed over a worn business card for a family law attorney in nearby Hammond who specialized in reopening adoption cases, her parting words carrying a note of caution about how such truths often unearthed more pain than peace in families clinging to their illusions of perfection. Returning home that evening with the card burning a hole in my purse and the weight of potential biological revelations pressing on my chest like an uninvited guest at a crowded dinner, I found myself drawn into a scheduled family Zoom call for planning Dad's upcoming 65th birthday bash, where Linda commandeered the screen with elaborate proposals for a luxury cruise down the river that ignored his preference for simple backyard grilling with the neighbors, her enthusiasm masking the underlying motive to splurge on an event that would showcase her organizational prowess amid her post-divorce insecurities. And spotting an opening amid the virtual chatter, I interjected casually with a helpful tip about a more budget-friendly alternative I'd heard through a contact, actually a fabricated lead that redirected their initial deposit inquiry to a nonprofit supporting single mothers in tough spots like Elisa's had been. A sly act of revenge that watched Linda's on-screen face contort in frustration as the chat filled with questions about the mix-up, while Mom tried to smooth things over with her diplomatic smile. The satisfaction of seeing her grand plans derail without direct confrontation filled me with a fleeting sense of empowerment. A witty payback for years of slights that felt justified in the moment yet carried the undercurrent of pettiness that might make outsiders question if I was prioritizing scores over the healing Dad deserved in his later years. And as the call wrapped with unresolved bickering, Dad messaged me privately afterward, his words laced with quiet disappointment about how my interference seemed to be fueling the family rifts he'd hoped the birthday would mend. A backfire that stung more sharply than I'd anticipated and left me staring at my reflection in the darkened computer screen wondering if my quest for truth was morphing into something more destructive than enlightening. Later that night, as I scrolled through emails in a bid to distract from the evening's fallout, my phone illuminated with a message from the Hammond attorney introducing herself as Margaret Ruiz and attaching a preliminary file scan that included a crisp photograph of the locket opened to reveal an inner engraving reading for my sister, always, alongside initials that tied directly to the calm voice from the restaurant night, unmasking the waiter as Alex, Elise's son and my potential half brother who'd orchestrated the envelope delivery to test the waters of reconnection without overwhelming the fragile Harlan dynamics. A twist that flooded me with a dizzying mix of hope and dread about integrating this lost branch into a family already teetering on exclusionary foundations. Just as I absorbed the implications, another notification pinged through, an email from Linda under the guise of reconciliation, inviting me to a neutral ground dinner at the original restaurant The Coming. weekend to hash out our differences once and for all, though the attached agenda hinted at deeper motives involving the will and unspoken alliances that promised a confrontation far more explosive than any birthday toast. The law office of Margaret Ruiz in Hammond unfolded before me like a repository of buried histories and legal entanglements that families like mine preferred to keep sealed tighter than a bank vault during economic downturns. Its cramped quarters filled with towering stacks of case files that leaned precariously against walls painted in a nondescript beige, as if to blend into the background of clients' often tearful confessions. And as I settled into the worn leather chair across from her desk, that afternoon, the attorney wasted no time in laying out the intricate mosaic of my origins with the precision of a prosecutor building an airtight case, beginning with the confirmation that Elise, the woman from Gary who'd haunted my recent drives and dreams, had indeed been my biological mother, whose relinquishment of me at birth stemmed not from casual abandonment, but from a desperate bid to protect an infant from the fallout of her own family's unraveling amid Dad's fleeting involvement in an affair during a low point in his marriage to Mom. A liaison that had produced not just me but a web of complications the adoption agency had smoothed over with paperwork designed to erase traces and foster the illusion of a fresh start for all parties involved. Margaret, a sharp-eyed professional in her mid-50s with a no-nonsense demeanor honed from decades of mediating sibling rivalries over estates and identities, handed over the unsealed letter from Elise dated just before her passing 5 years earlier from complications of a long battle with factory-related respiratory issues, its handwritten pages detailing regrets over the secrecy imposed by circumstances and revelations about a half-brother named Alex who'd grown up piecing together fragments of her story while working odd jobs in Chicago restaurants to fund his own quiet search for lost connections. The same Alex who'd posed as the waiter that fateful birthday night to deliver the envelope and gauge my readiness for a reunion without shattering the Harlan facade prematurely. Absorbing the words through a haze of tears that blurred the elegant script on the page, I grappled with the ambiguity of this disclosure that reframed my entire sense of self not as an outsider grafted onto the family tree, but as a branch intertwined with both biological and adoptive roots in ways that blurred the lines Mom and Dad had drawn so rigidly during those awkward talks about your special place in the household, and Margaret elaborated on how Linda's barbed exclusions at gatherings masked her deeper anxieties about the will's equitable divisions. Having gleaned partial truths from eavesdropped conversations with the family lawyer that positioned my potential biological claims as threats to her financial security, especially after her divorce, stripped away the joint assets she'd counted on for her vision of perpetual stability in Naperville's upscale circles. The dilemma weighed heavily as I left the office with the letter folded carefully in my purse alongside the locket now heavy with confirmed meaning, torn between confronting the family immediately to demand accountability for years of sidelining or holding back to spare Mom the pain of Dad's past surfacing in such a raw form. A choice that carried the undercurrent of vengefulness critics might decry as prioritizing personal score settling over the collective healing that could mend rifts before they became irreparable chasms. Yet the invitation from Linda for a reconciliation dinner at the Original Italian restaurant that weekend arrived via email with an attached agenda outlining open discussions on family roles and futures, her tone laced with feigned olive branch civility that I suspected hid maneuvers to consolidate her position on inheritance matters through subtle alliances with Aunt Clara and the cousins. Opting to attend despite the internal warnings flashing like hazard lights on a foggy highway, I arrived at the restaurant under a clear autumn sky that contrasted sharply with the storm clouds gathering in my mind. The familiar fluorescent hum greeting me as I navigated past the host's stand to the same corner booth where the birthday debacle had unfolded weeks earlier, now set for a smaller group comprising just Mom, Dad, Linda, and myself in what she billed as a sisterly summit to air grievances without the peanut gallery of extended relatives, turning it into spectacle fodder for the next block party. The air thickened with forced pleasantries as we settled in, Dad cracking jokes about the menu's unchanging specials to ease the tension while Mom fussed over the breadbasket with her usual nurturing gestures that always seemed directed more at diffusing conflicts than addressing their roots, and Linda dressed in a power blouse that screamed boardroom rather than family hearth, steered the conversation toward neutral topics like Dad's recent golf outings before circling back to the agenda with pointed questions about my recent distractions that hinted at her surveillance through mutual contacts who'd reported my Hammond visit. As appetizers arrived steaming with garlic and promise, Alex materialized as our waiter once more. His presence a subtle nod of solidarity that emboldened me to reach into my bag and place the locket deliberately in the center of the table amid the clinking silverware, announcing in a voice steady with rehearsed calm that it turned out some adoptions carried hidden engravings and sibling surprises that even the scales without needing a single drop of contested blood to prove worthiness at the family table. The booth plunged into stunned silence broken only by the distant clatter from the kitchen, Mom's hand flying to her mouth as the pieces of Elise's letter and Alex's roll clicked into place with audible gasps, while Linda's face drained of color faster than wine spilling from an overturned glass, her eyes darting between the locket and Alex, who lingered nearby with a tray of water refills as if ready to join the fray. And in that suspended moment, I unveiled the witty core of my revenge by recounting how her whispers to the lawyer about challenging my inheritance share had only accelerated my discoveries, exposing her gatekeeping not as protective loyalty, but as calculated fear of sharing the Harlan legacy with anyone whose bonds didn't originate in the maternity ward she claimed as her exclusive domain. Arguments erupted in waves, Dad's voice rising in defense of his choices to shield us all from past mistakes, while Mom wept quietly over the affair's long shadow, and Linda countered with accusations of betrayal that rang hollow against the evidence now laid bare. But as Alex pulled up a chair at my invitation to share Elise's side in measured tones that humanized the woman we'd all mythologized or vilified in absence, the satisfaction of the reveal washed over me like a cool breeze through the stuffy booth. A clever unmasking that delivered payback without fists or fury yet left ethical quandaries dangling like the locket's chain, had I sought justice or merely amplified the fractures for my own catharsis, especially when Mom's hurt gaze questioned if blood revelations could ever truly bridge the emotional gaps adoption had carved. As the main courses grew cold amid the emotional tempests, the bill arrived split evenly without protest, and I contributed my portion with a smile that masked the hollowness creeping in, pondering aloud whether family defined itself through the tables we gathered around or the secrets we unearthed from beneath them. A rhetorical musing that prompted nods from Dad and tentative reaches from Mom's hand across the linen, but met Linda's glare with unyielding silence, and as we dispersed into the night with hugs that felt tentative rather than transformative, the questions lingered unresolved in the crisp air. Would I embrace Alex's branch or retreat to my Milwaukee solitude? And could choice ever fully supplant the pull of origins in a world that prized bloodlines like heirlooms over forged connections, leaving the Harlan story suspended in ambiguity that invited endless reflection without the comfort of tidy closure?